Hello. In this video, we will talk to you about how Snowflake is planning to move away from password-only sign-ins and how you should prepare for such a move and build migration plans. My name is Anoosh Saboori. I'm a principal product manager at Snowflake and work in security. Alongside with me is Seth Youssef.
Hi, everyone. Seth Youssef. I'm based out of Paris, France. I'm a security global field CTO and happy to be here.
Happy to have you here. All right. Snowflake has always been committed to helping customers protect their accounts and data. To further our commitment to protect against cybersecurity threats and to champion the advancement of industry standards for security, we recently signed the CISA Secure by Design pledge. In line with the CISA Secure by Design principles, we're updating our default authentication policy to require strong authentication. Namely, starting in October, multi-factor authentication would be required by default for all human access to Snowflake for new accounts created. We are also increasing the minimum set of length of password to 14 characters. This is not going to be the end of this. Early in 2025, we plan to apply the same policy to all existing Snowflake accounts. And at some point in future, we are going to get to a place where password-only sign-ins are not going to be allowed to Snowflake. As you can imagine, the key takeaway here is that password-only authentication is not a long-term viable choice anymore for accessing Snowflake, and it's very critical to start upgrading and thinking about how we can be ready for that move. It is also noteworthy to call out that Snowflake has taken customer security seriously from day one. We have released and supported features to improve our customer security and MFA starting in 2015 when our first major release of Enterprise came out. In that first major release, we included MFA. Later on in 2016, we added the single sign-on experience, and 2017, the support for OAuth. So what we're really announcing today is a simple change to our default behavior that requires MFA. And this is actually a part of a much bigger effort to push to strong authentication across all Snowflake services, right? And I think it's worth to talk about what does it mean when Snowflake think about strong authentication. So for us, it depends on the type of the user. For human users that have interactive login to Snowflake, we first recommend that you move to single sign-on experience and turn on multi-factor authentication on your IDP site. If that's not an option and you have to use a Snowflake native and local identity system, then we recommend turning on multi-factor authentication from Snowflake. For service users that have a programmatic access to Snowflake and normally do not have an interactive login, we recommend using protocols like external auth or keeper authentication combined with network policy. And to help with kind of quantifying if you're using the best practices, we are introducing the notion of healthy users, right? Which is basically depending on the type of the user, looks at what kind of credentials they're using and whether this network policy is present. This tabular format kind of summarizes that. So for example, if a human is accessing a Snowflake through SSO, then they're considered to be healthy. If they're using local password, they have to use MFA before they're called healthy. And with the same concept, we define a user to be risky if they're not healthy, as simple as that. And also to help with the migration to the strong authentication and as part of our shared responsibility model, we have recently introduced a set of features, starting with MFA Nudge, user types, MFA enforcement policy, and trust center. And we'll do a quick review of what those things are. Starting with the MFA Nudge, this is an experience in the Snow side, which is a UI for Snowflake. When the user is signing with a password and if they haven't enrolled in the multi-factor authentication, they'll see a modal experience urging them to enroll in MFA. This modal would then help them walk through setting up MFA, and they can still dismiss this and snooze it. But it is a way for us to get customers and users introduced to the concept of MFA and promote using it. The second feature was ability for admins to annotate user types. This new type that is part of the user object supports three types or three values, right? Person is for humans, and then we have service and legacy service. Service, when you set that type to service, then what it does under the cover is that it then disables password for such users, and we recommend to use, as I mentioned earlier, keeper or external OAuth. combined with network policy, and always monitor. We also introduced the notion of legacy service, and the reason for that was we anticipated some applications to have a longer path to deprecate password. And so we wanted to provide a way for such users to be exempted from ongoing policies, right? And so with legacy service, you can continue using password like today. We still recommend setting up network policy for such users, but basically this is a way to grandfather existing users until there's a clear path to upgrade. And it's worth to call out that if you set the type equal to service or legacy service, such users would be exempted from MFA policy. The reason for this is such users normally have a non-interactive login, and so it doesn't make sense to prompt them for multi-factor authentication. Instead, we require them to use things like external auth or key pair with network policy. And one thing that I would like to call out is that if you don't set the type, default into treating them as person or human. The other thing that we introduced was a set of policies that allows admin to require MFA, right? There are multiple ways you can use this as part of the authentication policy. For example, you can set MFA for local users. So if you set the MFA authentication method equal to password, then every signing with an actual password to Snowflake would then require an MFA. You can also require a Snowflake MFA in addition to your IDP MFA, right? And so if you set the MFA authentication methods to also include SAML, then basically the user will see a second prompt. This is interesting for cases where you have a very privileged users and you want to have a defense in depth, or in some cases where the customer does not have IDP, their own IDP doing MFA, they can rely on Snowflake for multi-factor authentication. And lastly, one of the core product that we introduced was Trust Center. It went to GA back in July. What it is a built-in interface to discover security risks and recommendation on how to resolve them. It by default comes with a free tier called the Security Essentials Scanner package. This looks for multi-factor authentication compliance and network policy usage issues. We also have another tier called the CIS Benchmark Scanner. Back in October last year, we introduced the CIS Benchmark for Snowflake platform. And so what this scanner does is scans the account for any violations against the benchmark. We're happy to also announce today that we're introducing a third scanner package called Threat Intelligence. And one of the first scanner we're introducing is one that looks for risky users, the way we identified earlier in the slide. And of course, the benefit of Trust Center is the fact that it is a cross-cloud way of doing risk posture management. And with that, you can reduce the risk in your account. And again, all of the experiences are going to be part of Snowsight, and Seth will walk you through how to do this. One last thing before we pass you to Seth to talk about migration is making sure that this is clear. There are multiple ways that one can connect to Snowflake. And this diagram shows some of the categories that are there, right? And it is very important that when you're thinking about migration, you look at all these surfaces. Do you use drivers? Do you use connected apps, managed apps, notebooks? And all of those connections have to be secure. If you have one insecure connection, you're still at risk. The good news is we at Snowflake have started a wide campaign working with all of our partners to make sure that our ecosystem is moving to the strong authentication, and pretty much all the popular tools that you may be using supports what we call strong authentication. We also make sure that the drivers that Snowflake provides fully support everything that we expect from a strong authentication perspective, and that's something to keep in mind. With that, I'm going to pass it to Seth to put everything together and show you how you can actually use these tools and products to kind of have a concrete migration plan. Seth, please take it over.
Thank you very much, Anoosh. Appreciate it. I'm going to go now and help you out with the migration guidelines to put all those new features and capabilities together. All right. Now, the migration plan, as you know, it has phases, right? And nothing will come out without a circle. So Anoosh likes to have pyramids. I changed that. I put a circle here. So the migration plan, it is detect, and then you plan the migration plan, and then you implement the protection measures, and you continuously monitoring your deployment, and then you repeat. So this is continuous enforcement of strong authentication. Now, when you go to the detect, as Anoosh mentioned at the beginning. So you start with Trust Center. Trust Center is introducing this threat intel scanner that will help you to go ahead and identify the risky users. Now that will be from the UI. We're going to show you a sample later on. If you want to go into deeper detail, we included here for you a sample query that can go ahead and show you why those users are risky. Right? Like if you go back to the flow, for example, if a user has a SAML authentication enabled on it, but that user has a password already configured, that's not compliant, right? You need to make sure once you migrate to SSO, no more passwords in Snowflake, right? Now, then probably later on, you need to find the distribution of users, types, client types as well across multiple authentication methods. So you will see, for example, how many users are using SAML, how many users are using password, key pair, OAuth. And this is a sample query as well that helps you to go ahead and check that yourself. So once you detect and identify the risky users, now go ahead to the planning phase. So first of all, we have a white paper. This is a link to the white paper. We're going to share the link with you as well, where it shows what you need to do, the different mechanisms that you need, technologies that capabilities that you need to apply. Now, part of the migration plan, you need to make sure you plan to leverage network policies, right? And Snowflake network policy that limits the access from outside or even from internal network to only from authorized IP addresses. Authorized, for example, if your users are coming from behind a VPN, probably you want to allow list only the VPN gateway. If you're coming from using private link, you're using a VPC ID or you're using a link ID in Azure, you need to make sure those as well as part of your network policy so you lock down your environment. Next, if you haven't done that already, please plan migration to single sign-on. And for you to know, you can configure single sign-on in Snowflake without impacting the current user base, right? So you can go ahead, configure everything, make sure it's working perfectly fine, and start and roll out your migration plan. Next here, you need to provision users in Snowflake. Like for example, when you go to single sign-on using SAML or OAuth, those users are already defined in your IDP, like Entra ID or Okta or what have you. You can manually create those user identities in Snowflake, and when you create them without passwords, right? Keep that in mind. Passwords are terrible. We don't like passwords, right? So, or you can use a SCIM. And a SCIM, it helps you to automatically provision users directly from your IDP. Now, what we're trying to do in here, and even like sometimes you see, okay, we're using key pair. If you recall that chart, how to detect a risky user, even with key pair, it's a good authentication mechanism, but still static, right? You need to make sure if you use password or use key pair, keep rotating those things, right? And this is why we introduced network policy in the top of key pair as well, to make sure you can use that key pair only from that specific trusted source. But we would like you to move away from any static credentials, passwords, or even a key pair. And after that, you would leverage user and account level MFA, and of course, network policy. And you can gradually roll out those. You don't need to start as a big bang, right? You can go ahead and start at limited set of users initially. And then what it happens is there are two use cases in here. Like, for example, when you connect to Snowflake with the ecosystem that Anoosh shared with you, is like you have an ecosystem with multiple apps around it connecting to Snowflake. There are applications that actually support stronger authentication mechanism. We're going to show you one of those apps later on. So all what you need is just you switch that to use like SSO or what have you, right? And then you have legacy application that doesn't support today stronger authentication, like they are using only password, for example. So this is where you need to work with that application provider to go and upgrade their system to support stronger authentication mechanism. And of course, this is a migration plan, right? This is something we need to put here. In case if you have any issue, you can always roll out, you can remove the MFA or the network policy for those specific users or accounts. So a few considerations around the migration plan here. So actually, I touched base upon a little bit of those, but just to enforce those points. So first of all, the SSO users should be created in your IDP, right? So if you have like a local user account, that probably is not valid to be used for SSO, right? Probably SSO, it has like an email format kind of username. And of course, we will leverage a scheme that will help you to go ahead and automatically leverage the automatic provisioning. And if you have, for example, an application that actually using local username and password, so when in the migration process, you will need to switch that user to go ahead and use the user that is already configured in IDP. There will be a downtime so during the switch over, so you need to plan for that as well. And after you successfully moved all your applications to use single sign-on enabled users, you will go back to Snowflake, for example, any unnecessary users, and you can have a query that shows you stale users or what have you that is never been used as well. You go clean them up. You can disable them initially if you to check if anything breaks, and later on you need to please, this is a part of identity governance, delete all the unnecessary user that you don't. And of course, don't forget the break glass situation. You might have a couple of account admin. Once you have those two, they will have local password. Please always go ahead and enable MFA for those local account admins. All right, now we move to the protection phase, which is, of course, here the migration to the SSO, if not there yet, and then make sure as well you set up the type. Anoosh that shared with you. We have 4 different types. It's called null, person, service, and legacy service, right? So legacy service is the one we consider it like a migration tool. Legacy service is not a long-term solution, right? So consider this as your migration tool. Next, roll out per user network policies first, right? Don't go ahead and roll out account level network policies, right? The moment, because that's going to have like wide impact of all the users in that account. So start small, right? For example, start with 10 users and then 100 users. If everything is okay, go ahead and enable account level network policies. And the same with MFA policies, right? So the MFA policies helps you with 2 things. First of all, it enforces the MFA, right? So you go ahead and start at small number of users and then grow those up and then apply it at the account level after you tag the users with a type. This is very, very important, right? And then all the details in the white paper that you have the link to it in the slide, and that will be shared as well with you. And then once you make sure you build that confidence, you can go ahead and apply MFA policy at the account level, and that's for catch all remaining human users, and always monitor the progress. In case if there is an issue, roll back. You disable it at the account level or at the user level. A few consideration here for the protection. So the moment you use a user with type service, right, that user cannot use password anymore, all right? So if that user needs to use the password because for a reason like the application that is connecting to Snowflake doesn't support OAuth, for instance, right? So you can configure that user with a type of legacy service. And as we said, please consider it as a migration tool. This is not a long-term solution, all right? And now for human users, again, start with the high privilege users. And remember, like we have situations where the high privilege users, they need maybe double MFA, right? And we've seen that happening a lot. Like customers, they have their own MFA and IDP, and they want to enable Snowflake MFA and on top of it just for double protection, those high privilege users. So start with those, make sure that it's working perfectly fine, and then move on to the rest of user population. And finally here, the continuous monitoring. Please make sure you leverage Trust Center. It will always give you the reports if there is any risky users coming up, even after you implement your the protection. But if you have MFA policy at the account level and you have network policy at the account level, so you have the catch-all. So probably that will decrease the risky users by massive amount of number, right? Now, one thing that you could consider and you could leverage as well, it's a native capability in Snowflake, it's native alerting, right? So you can go ahead and check all the time for extra hygiene, right? So you can go and check if a user doesn't have a type set, right? Set a notification, set a timer. Like the system admin needs to go ahead and set a type for that specific user. If the application is using static credential or a key pair, probably you need to set alert saying, okay, after 6 months, that has to be migrated. After that, it will go to risk, right? It's high risk. And always as well use those tools as to help you to go and reach out to all legacy applications that do not support OAuth or stronger authentication mechanisms for them to start upgrading and migrating away from static credentials. All right, so we built here the migration plan. Let's me show you in action that migration plan. We have a little demo for you. We're going to be showing that next. With the start of the demo, we're going to follow the migration plan. So we're going to go with the Protect first in here. And this is the Trust Center dashboard where you can access it from a monitor. And then you go to Trust Center here. And then you can see we have a few violations over here. The new scanning package that Anoosh just mentioned is here. You're not going to see it environment yet. That's going to come up later on. And then here you can click on that and you go to the summary and you see we have a few risky users, right? So I want to see why those are risky. So what you need to do here, so we have this query for you, the one we discussed. Here you go. If you go ahead and run this query, so it will show you pretty much everything we discussed in that flow, right? So this is a user here. It has a password. So you see all this bad, right? So this is bad. They have a password. We should go, remove those from the system. And then look, of course, they don't have a public key. We don't use that. They don't have account level authentication policy, no enforcement policy. And you can move as well and check the network policy and what have you, right? So this will give you a very good view of why those users are not healthy. Next, here, like for example, you want to go ahead and see the distribution of those users between the user type and authentication methods being used. As you can see here, for instance, you see what is the reported client type. So I'm using a lot Snowflake UI. And then others, you will see, for example, here I'm using Duo for MFA, for instance. And of course, it's pretty much shows this is the type as well. It shows you the type is person. I have set a type for those users as well, and legacy service because some of them are, I have to use password for that. So let's go and remediate one of those users, for example, local demo admin, right? So I'm going to go ahead and remediate that. So we're going to see how we can enforce MFA for that particular admin, for instance. So you log into it. And once you go there, as you can see, and we've checked with you, I'll explain to you the nudge. So this is the nudge, right? So I'm going to go ahead and enable MFA for that particular user. Start setting up the MFA. We go here. I'm based out of Paris, France. Continue. It's an iPhone. All right, and we're done, right? So this now the domain demo admin, which is a high privilege user, is protected by MFA here. Now we have a user, for instance, a user that is, it needs to go and use a single sign-on. And we configured that as well with the Entra ID for that aspect. But anyways, any IDB that supports SAML should work. Now we're going to be demoing here how you can integrate a tool like Power BI. We have a lot of customers using Power BI, and how to migrate from username and password to single sign-on. So this dashboard is configured with a data source that works with username and password. So we're going to go ahead and migrate to single sign-on. So you need to provision the single sign-on user in Snowflake, and you configure external OAuth in Snowflake, and all the steps are well documented in our documentation. So you can go just search for Snowflake Power BI single sign-on, and you see the steps. Now, how you can migrate here is simply you go to the data source settings, and you click on that specific data source. You edit the permission, and the native connector that comes out with Power BI actually supports single sign-on. So you can go ahead and do that. And I'm logging in here using a user that already configured an Entra ID, as well as I use as well as I enabled MFA for that specific user as well in Entra ID. Here you go. Okay, you go ahead and save, you close, and you refresh. And the connection is successful. Right now, you are using single sign-on. And when you refresh this dashboard here, it's going to show you as well here the user. Actually, I used this user before as a single sign-on. So you see we're using ODBC driver, and this user has a type of a service as well. So it is already tagged. So in the previous demo, we showed you how to migrate from Power BI using username and password to single sign-on. And here we're going to be showing you as well how you can actually use SAML to log into your Snowflake account. So there is a DBA called SSO Bob. So that is already configured in Entra ID, configured with MFA, and as well as the user is provisioned without password, right? Just keep that in mind. When you use SSO, you don't need a password in Snowflake. I'm going to go ahead and log in to that specific user now by using Entra ID here. So you click on Entra ID. And of course, if you don't want to see that, you can use MFA policies that will force a specific user to actually use a specific authentication method. And basically here, what I've done is I already signed in here using Entra ID. But what we can do is we can go ahead and log off right away here, and we can go ahead and try it again. I want to show you like you can enable MFA on your Entra ID. So here you go. So you go to Entra ID, you log in using this is the specific user that is already provisioned in Entra ID. This is the password for that specific user. Here you go. And that user is already enabled with MFA using Microsoft Authenticator. Here you go. And you're good to go, right? So this user is DPA has just those two roles, and they can go ahead and do their work as needed. And of course, as we discussed before, you can go ahead and monitor that specific user as well. Let me show you that really quick here. So you can go ahead and monitor that specific user, the distribution between as the one we discussed, or like you want to see what are the actual logging or authentication that has been used by that specific user. You can see that here. I'm going to decrease the size a little bit. And then you can see, for example, SSO Bob basically is accessing here and using SAML as an authentication mechanism. And previously, when we used Power BI, you can see here, this is using OAuth as an authentication mechanism, and they are not using password anymore. So this specific users, they are using password, they are already protected by an MFA. So, and with that, we showed you how you can leverage Trust Center to go and check for risky users, and then enable MFA locally for specific users, how you can use SAML with Entra ID for other set of users, and then how you can migrate a tool like Power BI from using username and password to a single sign-on. And we showed you like those users actually using those authentication method as being logged internally in Snowflake account usage. Anoosh, it's back to you.
Thank you so much, Seth. This was very helpful. All right, just to reiterate, the main and the key takeaway from today's call is that passwords are not a long-term viable solution to access Snowflake. And we have the intention to move away from password-only signing. We started that in October when we're going to enforce multi-factor authentication on all new Snowflake accounts. And early in 2025, we are going to bring that to all existing Snowflake accounts. And again, in some point in future, we're going to completely stop accepting password-only signing. So this is not a question of if, it's a question of when. And we highly recommend that you start looking at all the tips and tricks that Seth showed you today to make sure you have a good migration plan in place and start executing on those. These things take time, and so preparation is important. If you have any other further question, we highly recommend you reach out to your Snowflake account managers and connect with us through there. Thank you so much for tuning in and looking forward to talking to you soon.
And one last note, the queries that we put for you you saw on the slides, those will be in the description section, so you will have access to them easily. Thank you very much.